Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending today's Caput Center for Research and Innovation in STEM Education's colloquium. This year, I decided to create some new colloquium formats, and this is our first ever Big Ideas colloquium. The goal of the Big Ideas colloquia is to have leaders in the field come and talk about an important issue in educational research rather than focusing on a single line of research or a single research study. Today's colloquium promises to do that as our guest speaker, Dr. Yasmin Kafai, talks about computational thinking 2.0. Dr. Kafai is the Laurie and Michael Milken President's Distinguished Professor at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, where she also holds a courtesy appointment in computer and information science. She is a learning designer and researcher whose work is very well known across education. For example, along with colleagues at MIT, Dr. Kafai developed Scratch, a programming language widely used to teach children how to code. More recently, she has investigated using electronic textiles to introduce computing, engineering, and crafting to high school students and teachers as part of the Exploring Computer Science curriculum. And if you'd like to know more about that effort, you might want to look at our 2022 colloquium with Dr. Deborah Fields, which is available on our YouTube channel. Dr. Kafai earned her doctorate from Harvard while working in the MIT Media Lab and has written numerous books about gaming and coding in educational spaces, as well as about constructionism. She is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association and the International Society for the Learning Sciences, and we are delighted that she is taking time to talk to us today. I will turn it over to Yasmin.
Well, thank you for inviting me and for this kind introduction, which of course raised the bar right now. Let me get the talk set up. So can everybody see the slides? I will just be slides, and let me immediately correct the title. It should actually be Computational Thinking 3.0, because already somebody else, as I will explain in a moment, took Computational Thinking 2.0, Matedri, and I don't want to take away from his perspective, which I will talk about. So since this is a big idea symposium, I'll talk about directions for the future of computing education. And in my background, probably many of you know, CS education in K-12 is a global phenomenon right now. 10 years ago, it looked very different here in the United States as well as in other places. But now we really can say that around the globe, there are efforts to bring computing education back into schools. And computational thinking is probably the umbrella under which all of them organize. And I have as my background here a slide from the Hour of Code, which also started 10 years ago as part of an actually kind of very successful effort to introduce computing to the larger population. And by now, over 1 billion people have participated in these activities. You may like it or not, whatever the Hour of Code is. I think it's a brilliant example of educational outreach, which many of us could kind of take an example of on how we kind of introduce and promote ideas to the larger education public. And the code.org people definitely have succeeded in making computing accessible. They also actually not close to more than a decade ago released a video which helped to kind of start the conversation. What schools don't teach. Don't worry, I will not make you watch that one. But as part of the video, there is a quote by the late Steve Jobs: everybody in this country should learn how to program a computer because it teaches you how to think. And I think that is also one of the reasons why computational thinking, which was kind of reintroduced by Jeanette Wing, has gotten such a recognition. Now, we all know that this connection between thinking, problem solving, and programming is quite tenuous and probably not the only reason which should kind of get us into computer science, but it definitely fits with the idea of computational of promoting computational thinking. And here is an excerpt from the short piece which Jeanette Wing wrote in 2006 as an opinion piece, if you want. It's the Communications of ACM. It's a professional magazine of the Association of Computing Machinery, promoting essentially, you wouldn't believe it, that computer science actually had an identity crisis at that time, but making the point on why working and learning with computers was important. Now, she is not the one who coined the term computational thinking. Often Seymour Papert and others are credited with it, but she definitely popularized it, and she called it computational thinking involving solving problems, designing systems, and understanding human behavior by drawing on the fundamentals of computer science. And this is a fairly kind of general definition, which has been picked up over the last 10 years in various ways. And most recently, I cannot help not mention OpenAI, ChatGPT, or Google's BART is coming back now in the whole discussion around artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I will say more about this also at the end. And so now the whole discussion on whether or not we should have computing education in school has actually kind of gotten a whole new urgency, more so than what it had 10 years ago when the first effort started of bringing CS back into school. So what I'm going to do today in 5 steps is kind of talk about first on how we can frame computational thinking, especially coming from an education perspective, not just a CS perspective. And what, I mean, a comparison and integration of framings kind of could offer us, especially in step 3, if we kind of cast the net a little bit wider by looking at computing literacies rather than just computational thinking as something which K-12 students need to learn. And then I want to talk about the expansion to computational thinking 2.0, and let me give credit to Matt Tedra and Peter Denning, who picked up on that term in previous books, and then close with some considerations on where we should go for computational thinking 3.0, which should have been the title of this presentation. So that's what we're going to do today. If you have any questions in between, feel free to put them in chat. Chandra will pick them up. I can see chat right now. I also see only a few people. So if you raise your hand, I probably won't see that either. So that would be fine with me. So coming back to computational thinking, as I said, with the kind of move of CS education into K-12, it has gotten incredible traction. I mean, there were reports by the National Academy on workshops on computational thinking. There are books which have been published, and not just in the US, actually all over the globe. And as you can see, even workbooks for K-12 students. So this is definitely something which has moved out of the ivory tower into educational practice. One thing which also has happened, and computer scientists are often not that much aware of, is that in education, we talk about learning and thinking in very different ways. We actually have multiple paradigms on how we think that thinking and learning should take place. And that is also reflected in the different framings. And I want to give credit here to my co-authors, Chris Proctor, who is now at SUNY Buffalo, and Deb Louie, who were part of a paper which we presented first at ICER in 2019, articulating these different notions. So there are 3 different framings, 3 different kind of conversations which are actually happening right now around computational thinking. So the first one is what we called a cognitive framing of computational thinking. And this is probably the most prevalent one. I mean, it values competency and skill building and programming and problem solving, you know, learning, debugging, learning iteration, learning loops, variables, data structures, all these things which we kind of associate with computer science. It also emphasizes university and future careers. And it very heavily draws from cognitive learning theories, focusing on internal models, the notional machines which students have on how a computer works and individual work. There are many curricula which have been kind of designed with this framing in mind. I put one of him here, the code.org Computer Science Discovery Series, which kind of embeds, is informed by this framing. And there's a history to it. In the 1980s, many people forget there was already a first wave of bringing computer science into schools. That was kind of the dominant framework. And lo and behold, cognitive scientists often think about the mind as a computer with, long-term memory as kind of hardware storage, short-term, and so on. And no excuse on why they kind of lean so heavily on this framing. So a lot of research which we have from this first wave, which looked at what was hard for students to understand, how to teach, really was informed by these kind of theories. And lo and behold, if you even look back now in many of the computer science education research studies, they're still kind of very heavily draw from this kind of body of work. I don't want to kind of devalue it. It offers us some really good understanding on what is kind of difficult, how to provide scaffold. But we all know from conversations in education, this is not all what there is to learning and teaching. And this brings me to what we called kind of the situated or cultural framing of computational thinking, which moves beyond kind of learning particular skills to also value personal expression and social connections through making. It particularly emphasizes shareability and real world context. And here, of course, the work in Scratch kind of became really important because it wasn't just a programming language, which kind of had all the features of a programming language, but it also provided a community where you could upload and share your projects. And it is heavily influenced by constructionist and connective learning theories. And I put here, of course, as an example, the curriculum which we developed unit for exploring computer science, working with electronic textiles, which, by the way, was modeled on the robotics unit. So we wanted to make sure that the students were learning the same concepts, just kind of in a different medium. And there's also a book which I wrote with Quinn Burke about kind of how I think one of the biggest shifts between the first wave of computing in the 80s or 90s, and then it went away for 20 years. And now is the shift of kind of making applications rather than just learning pieces of code. And then also sharing, being part of a community. And many, even of cognitive kind of framed applications, focus on this idea that you're actually building a computational artifact. And then in the last few years, a critical framing of computational thinking has kind of emerged as an equally important framing. And here, we're really kind of promoting agency and voice, drawing heavily on critical Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, which promotes, examination and resistance of existing power structures through reflection. And applications here have, personal relevance, but more so even focus on political, ethical, or moral challenges of the world. So one example actually draws on work from Clifford Lee and Elizabeth Zob, kind of creating not just an application, an app, but one which examines gentrification, ramification in neighborhoods. So brings together community as well as political concerns. And they just actually a few weeks ago published a book with MIT Press, Code for What, to showcase many examples. They're not the only ones who have kind of used, this particular perspective. And I think, each proponent of those framings would kind of claim computational thinking for them. So if you look at them, I mean, you can kind of see that they use very different units of analysis, which is not surprising. I mean, from the individual to a community of practice to society structures of power and opportunity. But I think what's also important for us as learning scientists and educators is that the epistemology behind them is very different. On cognition, we'll focus very much on skills, knowledge, competencies. In a situated perspective, we're much more concerned with practices, participation, and in critical social action. And consequently, the priorities on what's emphasized as an outcome for computational thinking are very different. I mean, for many of us in education, these are really not new perspectives. I mean, we have similar discussions in math education, in science education, in literacy, but for computer scientists, this is kind of fairly new. I mean, they are kind of slowly opening up to the idea that there is more than cognition to kind of understand what it means to become proficient in computer science. What is interesting when you look around many of the studies which kind of have embraced one of these framings, there is a common focus on designing applications. I mean, so what was very prevalent in the 1980s were these kind of short toy programs which kids were designing as part of their instruction, which was no particular relevance or connection or anything. And Edith Harrell, who was one of my advisors at MIT, was actually the one who promoted instructional software design and this idea that kids kind of create meaningful applications like games, like animations, things they're already familiar with. One thing though, if you kind of, and this is a very rough categorization, so cognition-oriented framings look very much at computational concepts and practices, and there's much less emphasis on personal relevance and social concerns. Situated folks kind of emphasize personal connection and interest, probably less so inclusion and cultural relevance. And then a lot of critical approaches often focus on social justice and discussion, but not always kind of include the learning of computational concept and practices. I realize I might do injustice to the one or other project, but lo and behold, if you look over all those studies, you will see some of those patterns. And the reason why this is important, this kind of different perspective, here I'm actually drawing on the work of Anna Svart, who wrote a very popular paper in the Educational Researcher at the height of the debates between cognition and situated researchers, you know, on the metaphors of learning and the dangers of choosing one over the other. And this is one of the papers which really stuck with me because she, I think, was so astute in pointing out what each framing brings, but then also what you lose, what you give up if you kind of embrace one. And her suggestion was that rather to stick to one paradigm, which might not be an easy sell to some people, is to really kind of look more at a patchwork of metaphors. I mean, so maybe we cannot create this unified, homogeneous kind of theory of learning. We rather have to live with a kind of patchwork metaphor. And Chris Proctor and I, we sat down and tried to think on what that actually would look like. And what we came up with is this, I guess, you know, it's afternoon, you could call it a donut if you're hungry. So, I mean, reflecting also the different units of analysis, when we look at computational thinking, I think we're actually talking about all of these things, but we're putting different emphasis. I mean, so in the cognitive, we're very much focused on the individual learner, their mental models and understanding, and the program code artifacts. And that tells us something very important, where students are, what teachers need to do. But we cannot look at the individual learner, especially if you work in a classroom setting or a community center, because all these other aspects are as critical parts of computing now, whether their friends, family. Most kids today have more powerful access to more powerful computers outside of school than actually in the classroom. Their friends on social media play a critical role, as well as their families. And the critical proponents have really brought in other aspects which are so important for computer science education, in terms of how exclusive these communities are, in terms of not reflecting gender and racial diversity. Silicon Valley is a prime example of it. And that everything we see around computer science is impacted by private corporations, government regulations, infrastructures, and all of that. And we actually kind of really need to look at all of these three at the same time rather than just on one of them. And I think that was kind of, this feels kind of very much like a theoretical examination, but I think it was important for people in computer science education, but also in education, to understand that CS education, computational thinking, isn't just one thing. Like all the other aspects we're discussing in other disciplinary contexts, computer science isn't just a discipline. It's also part of a larger social and political enterprise. And I actually want to give you a moment. With Zoom, remember how you can take a thing and kind of write on Zoom, but please don't do this, and I have to clean the screen. But I want you to think where you are located. And I should say the donut should actually be dotted lines, because there are definitely people who see themselves more sitting on the boundary rather than clearly in one circle. But take a moment and think about your own research and your own perspective on computational thinking. Where are you? I mean, in that kind of realm. Because I'm pretty sure we're not all occupying the same space. And that's okay too, but it's also important to realize that some of us are maybe very clearly located at the outer range, focusing on one particular aspect, while others focus more specifically on skills and concepts. And we need to kind of figure out on how we create connections between these different framings, because I strongly believe that Anna Svard had her finger at a critical element of learning. We can't just kind of be exclusive in our research, because the realities in classrooms and learning situations take all of these aspects into consideration. So, I mean, in a nutshell, I mean, what we, and this is the follow-up piece which Chris Proctor and I wrote in Educational Researcher, if we think about computational thinking really needs to include all of these, maybe a better way to think about it is really coming from the literacies movement, which, if you remember, you read the New London Group, 1989, moved away from one just modality of thinking about print and text as being literate, but kind of talked about literacies. And so about computational thinking, beyond concepts and practices, we also need to include an understanding of values, biases, and histories, which are embedded in the digital technologies. And a literacies perspective allows us to kind of take into account all of these aspects, because when we talk about literacy, and here I'm actually drawing, I should give credit to Sylvia Scribner, a very famous long-term literacy scholar. And she was the one who pointed out that literacies are actually operate on 3 different levels. And one of them is what she called the functional level. It's a basic understanding of what it means to read or write, or in the case of computer science, of what a basic understanding of reading, writing code allows us about the interfaces, technologies, and systems we encounter daily. And I would claim, I mean, whenever discussions around literacy happens, most of the time people have this kind of adaptation, this functional level kind of in mind of what that is. But she also, yeah.
We have a question real quick, which is,
okay.
In what framing does career path awareness lie?
It probably could lie in all of them, because some of the original computational concept practices, perspectives talk about STEM career awareness. It would also lie in the second as well as in the third one. One of the challenges is when we talk about career awareness, is that we often think we teach computer science so that everybody can get a job in Silicon Valley and the high-tech industry. And I don't really think that should be the reason. Now in Washington, college and career kind of opens money for interventions. But when I really think about literacy, I really think about kind of the broad European educational framing, kind of being educated, of becoming a citizen, and not necessarily a specific kind of a job. Now, I know the job, well, given the latest round of layoffs, I mean, not all is kind of so well in the tech industry either. But we don't teach reading and writing that everybody becomes a writer. We don't teach mathematics that everybody becomes a mathematician and so on. I mean, that's not really the purpose of K-12 schooling and being literate. I mean, some people may choose to kind of follow that path, but that career path. But that said, I mean, helping people to understand, students to understand what different career paths is definitely a worthwhile enterprise, especially one which kind of go beyond just programming or coding, but to see the whole gamut of different applications. That, by the way, was it Ali who asked that question? Was one of the reasons I got involved in electronic textiles, because I thought it showcased a different application of computational design than what most people associate with electronics, games, robots, and so on, to help people, students, broaden their perspectives on where computing is, what it can do, what you can do. You can probably do this with many other applications, but that's just the point. So coming back to the literacy, so we have this functional level on what it means to be literate in code. But then we also have a power level. I think the reason why we want people to be literate is to be able to understand the decisions which went into making systems, to be able to question them. All of this, what kind of populates their screen. There's a whole political infrastructure. And then finally, Sylvia Scribner also pointed out grace, and she says on a personal level, it's important to be literate for expressive purposes, to better communicate. And I always give the examples. 100 years ago, you drafted a love letter to roast somebody. Well, now you compose, I mean, a funny tweet, well, maybe not a tweet anymore, but to make a TikTok video or something else to show, I mean, but that means that you understand on how to master the medium. And that's important too. That has nothing to do with jobs or anything. It's really about personal fulfillment. I mean, on a private and social level. And I think when we talk about becoming literate, we talk about all of these 3 things. And also when we talk about computation, I mean, because it's so pervasive in all aspects in youth social media nowadays that it can no longer be ignored. So, you know, and looking at these kind of three different perspectives, Chris Proctor is actually a former English high school teacher, so he chose that as an example. You know, from a cognitive, yes, we want people to understand the English grammar, vocabulary, style, but we also want to understand voice, audience, authentic writing, as well as from a critical perspective, power, oppression, identity, and culture. So computer science, I mean, literacies are no different than from what we talk in the context of literacy, language literacies, or even also in mathematics and science education. We just have kind of different framings for that. And she was also astute to point out, Sylvia Scribner, that when we talk about literacy, this is always a political enterprise on what we define. You know, we may actually lack consensus on how best to define it because we have very different views of what the social purposes and values are. And I think we see that actually every day played out in education on, you know, what books to read or ban, or and likewise, there are similar kind of discussions around what it means to be computational literate. That is a kind of consensus we have to develop. To what extent we focus on functional, political, or personal aspects. And then I think what is important for education is kind of addresses three questions: who, what, and how. So, you know, of course, you probably heard CS for all is a big slogan, which kind of was, I think, launched also by the Obama administration and pushed by NS National Science. And that we're saying everybody needs to learn about computer science. And here again, from that quote from the K-12 CS framework, so that we have enough skilled technology workers. So you can see how the kind of job aspect is kind of finding its way, even in general standards. But we also know that there are enormous challenges in realizing a CS for all. We don't have enough, I mean, teachers to teach courses at the high school level. Not all schools actually have a CS teacher. Not all students have access. So this is, I mean, a long road to actually make that a vision. Another aspect is, I mean, to what extent we talk about what should computer science education be about? And I think in the end, this question can only be answered if we take into account also the computational literacy practice of diverse communities and cultures. I mean, it can't just be Silicon Valley via code.org deciding on what the curriculum is. And they have actually literally done this because many states and districts not having the resources and people on board to deal with this just kind of adopted their curriculum. And I think that's definitely something which needs to be addressed. And then also, I mean, for any educator, how should we teach computer science is an equally important question. How, I mean, we can integrate where we should integrate computational thinking into existing literacy. Should it be a standalone course? Who is reflected? What is reflected in those activities? Those are all still big questions we are struggling right now with as CS education is moving back into K-12. And those struggles, again, are not alone to computer science. They're equally prevalent in other STEM areas in general. So that was kind of my talk before ChatGPT kind of came along, computational thinking. And we have right now, I mean, an incredible attention, maybe for the wrong reasons, on what computational thinking is about. as these generative AI systems have kind of entered the market, partially because people are concerned that they're going to do students' homework, which of course raises a whole lot of question on what kind of homework is even be assigned. But these systems are not going away. Google just released BART and ChatGPT from OpenAI. I mean, there are tons of them around. And Silicon Valley is kind of now moving into AI, and I mean, as a kind of next best thing. And I think that raises important questions of what, I mean, the computational thinking needs to kind of include. So ChatGPT is, I mean, I just pulled some slides from the internet. Every teacher needs to know about this, so they know whether the students are handing in their own work or are cheating. And, you know, it's even writing code. I mean, so do students even write the code? Some people have a more balanced view. This was a piece in the New York Times, rather than to ban it, which some districts has done, to kind of think about how we can kind of actually live and coexist together with these systems and help students understand on how they can harness the power. And it clearly has an impact on computer science education. I'm sure most of you are familiar with, a few years ago, Turetsky, Gardner Kloon, Martin, and others published the 5 big ideas in artificial intelligence on what this particular area of computer science, which was not, I mean, I think at all reflected in the current CSK 12 framework, should include. There's learning from data, there's natural language interaction, perception, representation, and then of course also societal impact. One of the challenges is when you read the paper, the report which was published, most of these activities are very kind of discussion driven. There's very little where students actually are engaged in making. Here is where computational thinking 2.0 came from. So Matt Tedre, a Finnish researcher, Peter Denning, and Toivonen, actually in the last 2 years have kind of pushed heavily on this computational thinking 2.0, and so they should own that particular term. I will not take that away from them. And what you see here is their attempt to kind of highlight what computational thinking 1.0 is, when students learn how to write code, to solve sorting problems, to write applications, and what changes when you have students engage, for instance, in writing machine learning or other data source heavy applications. And it's very interesting because it looks like kind of 2 different perspectives on a discipline. You know, you collect data, you clean it, you train a model, you evaluate. You actually don't know what happens. Even experts don't know what happens in those neural nets. You experiment with data. A lot of it's black box and everything. And I think it really highlights, when we talk about computational thinking 2.0 from this perspective, that students are engaged in a qualitatively different aspect of computer science, one which is still and always has been part of computing. I mean, for those of you who are familiar with the history of computing, you know, we had many hype periods of artificial intelligence and then the long winters, but now the winter is over and it's AI springtime again, concurrent with current springtime. And here are some other aspects which Matti Tedre and others articulated on what they think is changing in computational thinking 2.0. So for one, we now have a whole new class of applications ready for classroom experiments. They even see that it is possible to have a deeper integration with STEAM subjects. And I think here's an aspect which I find very interesting: access to bodily and natural language interactions, which have mostly been absent in computational thinking 1.0. And this might also be one of the reasons why a lot of studies are actually done with fairly young children. Most of the computer science programming is located later elementary, middle school, high school level. A lot of these machine learning interactions, training the models can be done with gestures and language, so are much more accessible to younger students. And they also articulated a number of CS practices, which are kind of will be different when we move from rule-driven to data-driven thinking in computational thinking. That we need new notional machines. For those of you who are not familiar, notional machines are these kind of mental models which learners develop on how operating system, on how a program, on how a machine is working. And many students probably do this intuitively without being kind of taught. But I think these are, like any mental model, very powerful kind of scaffolds to help them understand what's happening. There's also new models of testing and debugging, which need to come into place when you no longer can actually examine what the exact code is, the semantics of the program. And there's, of course, direct connections to the topical issues and AI issues. So it's not that computational thinking is going away, it's just taking a different shape. And I think they were right in kind of pointing out that at least from the discussions of computational thinking 1.0, these aspects were not explicitly kind of mentioned. And I want to point out, to bring back my donut, I mean, that this kind of definition of what computational thinking 2.0 is essentially happening under the same framings which we can apply, which we apply to computational thinking 1.0. Most of the things which, let me bring back the slide, which you see here, really remind us of these kind of cognitive perspectives on what coding, machine learning, understanding machine learning is about. So we still have that kind of perspective on concepts and practices. And we need to think about ways in which these kind of can be personally relevant. And there are many examples in use everyday life, TikTok, music, filters, I mean, systems where kids already early on have connections, personal intelligent devices like Siri, Alexa, Dot, which are in many people's homes. And equally important, of course, the critical issues, I mean, which kind of get lumped under the ethics. We all know about algorithmic bias in face recognition. This is the perception part, what these systems generate. So I think these framings don't go away. They're as present in computational thinking 2.0 as they were in 2.1. But now we have a new genre of context and things to think about in making that a reality. And here, in kind of wrapping up, are a few of my thoughts where we kind of need to move what I would call computational thinking 3.0, if you want. One of them in the technical field, CS, there's a lot of talk about technical and ethical debt about the systems which are released. And for those of you who don't know the term, technical debt is often that called when companies just release software, they know it doesn't work, but they figure out, okay, you know, once everything is running, we'll kind of fix whatever doesn't work. So, but one of the challenges with that approach is, of course, that once you have released these things, you can't take them back. I mean, you have actually already impacted people. And this is what people call the ethical debt. Because when a lot of these AI solutions are developed in companies which have very clear ethics and procedures, actually don't even sit down before and proactively identify what those concerns are. And there are so many examples in terms of prison sentencing, healthcare, and many other issues where the impact of these debts, I mean, is actually life-threatening and impactful. So I think in any discussion we have when we introduce students to computational thinking, we also need to include now discussions around technical and ethical depths. I mean, that students are aware these systems are released and that there is an impact, and how can we make, and the challenge will be how and when can we make that accessible to students. Another one, which is much more insidious, is actually question the models of learning and intelligence which underlie many of these systems. And I'm building here on a work from Yarden Cutts from the Berkman Center, who wrote in Manufacturing and Artificial Intelligence Revolution. When you look more closely on how these systems are designed, they all employ behaviorist designs. I mean, reinforcement learning. I mean, this is what behaviorism was all about. And as Shoshana Zuboff observed, that this buy into behaviorist psychology is essentially the idea that human autonomy is irrelevant and the lived experience and psychological self-determination is a cruel illusion. And I think that, is something which isn't very often discussed. It's kind of just assumed these systems are out there. But they have kind of picked the easiest model to kind of put into their systems, like many instructional designers used to do drill and practice software. And, I had students 30 years ago design instructional software. Lo and behold, they all were working in a constructionist environment, and they were all designing drill and practice software, because it was the easiest to design with the limited kind of software skills they had, and they could produce the most content. So we have a kind of repeat here where, Silicon Valley just kind of had adopted one particular model of learning and plugged it into their systems without really kind of realizing, when we think about learning, we have, a much broader perspective on what that actually is. And I think that all has really implications for kind of maintaining and building an inclusive digital publics. In Connected Code with Squinberg, we wrote, I use the analogy to urban and city planners. Most of urban and city planning was done top down, very much like how the companies release the AI systems. And at some point, people realized that citizens needed to have a voice in the urban public if cities were to become livable places again in the 70s and 80s. And we have developed processes and mechanisms to involve, neighborhood people in the design decisions. And I think now it is upon computer scientists and educators to realize that citizens also need to have a voice to make and keep the digital public as livable and inclusive. I added this because that's not in the original quote in the book, space for all. So I think that is a tall bar for K-12 CS educator, but oops, I think somebody is unmuted. To reach their potential for individual opportunity and social transformation, we have to take on these challenges, which are coming now with computational thinking 3.0, in order to achieve this goal of kind of creating computational literacies. So that's all what I have, and I'm open for questions. Let me stop sharing so I can see you.
Okay, we already have a question ready from Tom.
Sure. So I enjoyed your presentation. I want to thank Beth Cullen for letting me know about this. But for 3 years now, the MIT Media Laboratory has had a website with K through 12 and adult programs for generative AI, both how that works and also ethical applications. Wonder, have you had any experience with the deployment of those programs, or could you refer me to somebody that's doing it so I could get some lessons learned?
No, it's one actually. Yes, I'm very familiar with this. I also know Stefania Druger, who has worked on the Cognanimates. Myself, we're doing machine learning applications. I think it's a great example of a curriculum out there, but most of these curricula have been driven to kind of focus on particular concepts. I mean, there's tons of different efforts out there. And I think we need to take a step back, kind of with these framings in mind, and examine what actually do we want the computational literacy, not just for kind of rule-driven, but also for data-driven, and in general to be. So because it's not just about teaching particular skills. I mean, that I admit will be a tall order for a lot of teachers. I mean, to just kind of, they just mastered the one piece to now bring in the new systems. But I think we need to think more generally, what do we want? I mean, the goal of computer science education to be. The K-12 CS framework, which was not developed with the data-driven, with these generative AI aspects, was very heavily cognitive focused. And I know that I was part of the larger group involved in the discussion. There was very little what we could do to kind of shift, to steer the ship into a different direction. So yes, there are plenty of resources, but they're not part of the standards or most kind of, if at all, kind of teacher education is happening right now.
Megan.
Thanks, Yasmin. That was so helpful and interesting. My head's spinning a little bit. So I have 2 questions, and I'm going to let you choose which question you want to answer, because both of them came up in the context of your talk for me. One has to do with earlier in your talk, thinking about the current environment that we are existing in today. That's about kind of civic engagement, challenging what counts as knowledge and truth. And I'm wondering how you think about the role of computer science in that particular challenge for us in this moment. The other question, though, is a little different, and that has to do with the extent to which you think schooling in this country is designed to do the kind of work that you're arguing that computer science work should look like and do.
So they're 2 different questions, but they're kind of coming at the same point. And let me start with the second one first, because I let me step back. When we developed Scratch was not developed for schools. It was actually developed for a community organization called the Computer Clubhouse, because there was no way computer science, anything would ever enter school. But I also realized the limitations of being in an out-of-school context. That said, I think it's critically an important part of our learning ecology. But I mean, the big lever in anything, if you want to do CS for all and reaching students who don't have access to computers at home, to teachers and everything, is going to be remaining school. And that's why I shifted away from out of school, back into school, designing curriculum, working with teacher, professional development, because I can only teach that many workshops. And we also know that in studies we have done in out of school context, most people don't really kind of level up to more sophisticated forms of participation without some support. So I mean, fully aware of the limitations we have of schooling, I still think if you really, aim for a population-wide kind of accessibility, you need to go via schools. That said, all the discussions we're having right now, and this comes to your first question around about what is truth, that is a big challenge. But I think this is a challenge which computer science education has skirted. Partially because Silicon Valley has pushed so many efforts, including code.org. Let's just be really explicit about that. And I think it's a challenge we need to face. If we in school can help students see, to at least begin to understand what those systems are, what their responsibilities, what their roles, and also what their rights are. then we will prepare a citizenship which will be completely at the mercy of those big companies. And they only care after the fact when things happen. I mean, I know we have the road in Europe where the governments take a much stronger stance in regulating what companies can and can't do. But I'm also not always very comfortable with that kind of stance. I mean, what if the government is taking a stance in the other direction, like we see in Russia or China, in constraining kind of participation and what the role of tech companies are? So in the end, it kind of brings us back to the critical place which education can play in helping, I mean, students and teachers, I mean, to come to a better understanding on what that is. And it's not going to happen in out of school. There's so many questions. Chandra, I'll let you to be the MC to choose who goes next.
Yep, I'm keeping track of the order. So Collins is next.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kafai, for your presentation. My question is, considering what you mentioned earlier, that computer systems are based on behavioral learning systems, so they are solving problems using like drill methods, that because it's easier to code for that. So in other words, like looking at the way forward, is the way forward making system or designing systems that will be solution based, finding different approaches to solve problems. So that's one of my questions. And then considering also ChatGPT, because we're looking at how human learns and taking we're taking ideas from computers in education to see how we can augment learning. Do you think we're at that point where the ChatGPT can have, say, intelligence that is able to produce work that is similar to humans yet?
I'm not a computer scientist, but I know that people are working on it. And there's a really great book by Melanie Mitchell. It says Artificial Intelligence, a Guide for Thinking Humans. She's an AI researcher herself, but I think she has a very nuanced perspective on what the current abilities, which are totally overhyped, and possibilities are. So to come to your question about, these systems are out there. So I think it behooves us, and you used a term which I actually very like, it's the augmentation term, which by the way has been around. People have talked a long time to move away from AI, artificial intelligence, to IA, intelligent augmentation. I mean, that conversation has already happened in the last 10, 20 years. But it's a model which is not about replacing human intelligence. It's more a model of kind of collaboration, of augmenting, I mean, human capabilities. And I think what generative AI with kind of constraints can do, we can figure out on how to kind of work together and leverage what the system produces. And by the way, I know this, I mean, anecdotally, when the system writes code and people put it into their program, they actually find it much harder to fix a code which the system writes than to write their own. Because, I mean, any programmer knows when you take the code from somebody else, making sense on whether it works or not is actually much more difficult than generating your own code. So, yes, you could hand it in as your homework, but you don't necessarily know. You have to invest quite some effort to make sure that it's actually correct. And I would say that is actually true of all the writing examples and everything else I have seen generated. Some of them are compelling, but some of them are, also require, and you need to do editing. And, we all know that for most students, it's not so much about generating text, it's the revising and the different iterations in writing, which are actually much more difficult, and a skill which is much more difficult to attain. So I think there are, in the current very overhyped discussion, these conversations around augmentation, collaboration, unfortunately, kind of fall always under the wayside. But they would also mean important skills that students develop about systems. My colleague Danae Metaxa here in CIS works on something like what she called algorithmic auditing. So that people develop skills that they can actually check the performance through multiple ways and how and whether an algorithm. So I think these are the kind of new skills Matt Taylor, Peter Denning were talking about, which we need to help students to get in order to work, efficiently and also successfully with these kind of systems.
Thank you.
Great. Next up is Esma.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. It was very nice. I have a question about, I would like to hear your personal opinion about what you consider the most important design element in the educational digital games. And my second question is, when you examine some educational digital or online games, do you see the biggest shortcoming or weak points? I'm really interested with the design process of the games, so I just wanted to hear your opinions about it.
Oh, games is not really that much on the forefront of my thinking anymore. I've done that for nearly 25 years. So to answer your question more broadly, I think it's a very powerful application. And we know that now the gaming industry has surpassed the movie industry in income. 10, 15 years ago, people didn't think that was possible, but that's the situation now. So games are here to stay. They're a really great, application. You also, by the way, have artificial intelligence, which now impacts kind of on how non-player characters participate. So that brings that topic also into the gaming industry. So I think, there is game design for entertainment, and then there is game design for learning. Where you leverage game elements on keeping motivation, providing feedback, multimodality. A lot of these things, which people already know for a long time, game designers have used much better than instructional designers. Also, they have more resources in design. So I hope this is satisfactory to you, but that's really not my kind of ballpark anymore.
Excellent. Rahini.
Hello, Dr. Kafai. Thank you so much for your presentation. This was so enriching, especially because I'm so interested in this topic. And kind of just going over what you said, and I'm aligning that with my thoughts. And I have this a bigger question. I always wonder, does computational thinking really vary by discipline? When I just think about the overall picture, I feel like experts in one field may not necessarily be successful in exploring other fields. And then sometimes I wonder about if computational thinking is independent of technology, or is technology and computational thinking so deeply connected that the two cannot be regarded as separate entities anymore? And I would love to hear your opinion on it.
Yeah, these are deep philosophical questions about, I think there are disciplinary differences. On how people in biology, chemistry, or in the digital humanities employ computers to do their research because they kind of come from different practices. They have different kind of questions. They work with different types of data. So I would think, that this is not the same. But Jeanette Wing's point, I think, in 2006, when the article was published, was her observation, and I think at the time she was even at NSF in the CISA directorate, was that all these disciplines have started using computing, and it has changed actually part of their practices. I'm thinking about scholars who have studied a writer or something and spent essentially their whole life kind of reading all the books, and now you have a machine which can kind of count all the terms and words. I think it's an aspect of disciplinary understanding, not everything. I think there goes much more what these people are doing when they're reading all of Shakespeare's work and everything else and the connections they're making. And from what I understand, most AI systems are not able, I mean, on that level to kind of make those connections yet. So that is, I mean, but that also means that, I mean, each discipline kind of builds and adapts the tools it needs and maybe also generates new perspectives. The ability to process large amounts of data is definitely beyond, I mean, the capacity of humans. A lot of these processes only make sense when you have large amounts of data. I mean, and I think that's sometimes very hard for students to understand when they only work with toy programs, because, hey, you don't really need a computer to do that. I mean, so that's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Walter?
Okay, Walter, I can't hear you. Nice to hear you again. You have to unmute.
The best way to hear me is unmute. That was true back when we were in graduate school, and it's
No,
just so,
that's not true.
I just have to, it's just so thrilling to see you and see how much you've accomplished since we were hanging out in the hallways of the Media Lab, and getting our degrees from maybe some other place too. Anyway, I'm fascinated by your talk. I'm fascinated by how much your thinking has developed in elegant ways. There's a fair number of graduate students at this thing, and so I want to. Some of the conversations about generative AI versus generative grammar and Chomsky's discussion of language, and actually the origins of logo. We're actually in list processing, so it never had a turtle aspect to it. It was actually deeply immersed in questions about how language was structured. And so Chomsky was on one side. In fact, Chomsky became famous for taking down Skinner's notion of language, because you can't build up a grammar from instances. And that was kind of his argument, which is coming back to haunt us, which is part of why Chomsky wrote a thing recently in the New York Times, reminding people that this is the same kind of debate that we had a long time ago. And Hilary Putnam, the sort of original AI philosopher, also accused AI, ultimately his own position, of being a kind of behaviorism. So that's interesting. But the thing I was going to ask about, Yasmin, for the graduate students, so I'm not going to, well, one thing I sort of feel like computation in a group setting or group computation is what might come next. And obviously I have a place in that, thinking about that. But the thing I wanted to ask about for the folks that want to think about your use of literacy is that maybe whether you see this video as being useful. There was the debate between Freire and Papert, centered very much on issues of literacy. And relative to Megan's question, whether school was a good thing or bad thing, of course, when we were going through graduate schools, schools were bad and evil places. I was doing a lot of work for Bob Moses's algebra project in inner city. So when I visited the Media Lab, I was the token reformer in a room full of revolutionaries. And so every time they had a question about reform, they always turned to me as that. But I think it's a really interesting discussion of literacy, in part because Freire's notion of literacy is so disruptive. It continues to be disruptive. And I think it's important to how you frame things, like the juxtaposition of literate and illiterate, which he was thinking about relative to the favelas and the adult literacy, if you will. So I'm just curious, mostly because I love hearing you talk, and I also reminding of our roots. That juxtaposition between Freire and Papert, would you recommend that or frame that in terms of your talk as something that the graduate students might want to think about, like you have obviously thought about very hard?
Well, you bring up a really interesting connection, which was already present. I think they had a conversation because Seymour, I think, felt very much aligned with Paulo Freire's thought, but I think critical theory might have also expanded into a new direction. And I think you're helping me, I mean, to be a little bit more nuanced. I mean, I I said, you know, schools are the big leveler with also all the recognition of all the challenges. And then I also, you know, I work with an incredible group of educators, of teachers all over the country doing incredible things in their classrooms. So I know good things are happening. So it is possible for school classrooms to be places of knowledge, places of challenge, places of kind of asking critical questions that these things don't can actually happen. So I want to acknowledge that outside of school, and I think that was Freya's argument, I mean, are equally important places. It just has kind of, when you look more broadly, that it is very difficult to kind of replace, I mean, a system like a public schooling system. With the kind of infrastructure it has created. And I think it's up on us to work with teachers to help them kind of make those connections and support them so that these conversations we have about computational thinking are not just limited to the skills and concepts, but have a possibility to kind of challenge the larger issues which we all know are at stake.
And that's part of what if we didn't, I mean, he pointed out to Patrick that we worked really hard to have persons who were not wealthy gain access to schooling or even any kind of literacy. It was actually a victory. And so Freire sort of pushed Patrick quite a bit on how there was actually a kind of critical dimension to school, even though there's much about school that is maiming. You know, we were brought up in graduate school. That was a way of describing what school does to kids' thinking. So thank you again.
And I will not, I mean, deny that this is not happening. I mean, that you know, there are schools which should definitely be closed and classrooms
okay. If I went back to graduate school, I would refuse to be a reformer. I've given up on it.
Okay.
Thank you, Yasmin.
You're welcome. Nice seeing you again, Walter.
And next up is James.
Hi, I want to thank you for this presentation. It was it's very interesting, and I appreciate the different perspectives, the discussion of the different perspectives on what on how we approach CS education. Oops, that's my watch is talking to me. So let's put that over there.
It's listening in.
That's right, it's listening in. So I'm in my fourth year of being a full-time high school classroom teacher of CS, and I think that the perspective I have in mind often varies, or it falls into these different categories depending on what kind of obligation or thing I'm worried about at any given moment. I want my students to express themselves with their CS creations. I want them to be creators of artifacts, not just users of artifacts. They're really adept at using the computing artifacts that are made for them, but you know, I want to see them make computing artifacts. And there are definitely times where I'm focused on, you know, can we give them an activity where I know that they're going to engage in expressing themselves or thinking about their community. And then there are times where I really wish they could write an algorithm and understand how a loop works. So, I mean, there are, you know, it just varies at different times. But I have found more and more that as I go along, when I have the most engagement is when I have the most expression, which my students are allowed to have in my classroom. You know, even when at first they think it's going to be a boring activity. I had my students today creating a choose your own adventure with, I mean, it was a simple activity with Google Slides. They're just thinking about choose your own adventure, breaking down it into slides. This is in a game creation class that I teach. And, you know, they said, oh, you're making slides, it's boring. And then 5 minutes later, they were all laughing. So, you know, and in groups working on their stories and building these artifacts. So So getting to my question for you, I want to see CS for all, and I believe that it's important for students. We have arguments for mathematics and English and other disciplines that it's important for students to make sense of the world. What do you see as the strongest argument in that, perhaps the most persuasive argument for CS for all students and not for them to become programmers?
But it's the same. Thank you for bringing this up, and I'll respond to something else you said earlier. But this is something I mentioned earlier. You know, we don't teach math to have people become mathematicians or writing, so they write the great novel. Only a few will kind of venture there. I think it's really the Sylvia Scribner kind of political as well as personal aspect, that these aspects, that these kind of literacies have a personal fulfillment in terms of how you can master and express yourself in that particular medium, but also in politically as a citizen on how you understand. You might not be an expert in accounting, but you know, when things are right, you know, you need some basic math to count 1 and 1 together. And I think computing is everywhere. I mean, it's not just at work where 20, 30 years ago, most computers were at universities. It's in entertainment, it's in health, it's in the jurisdiction system. Everywhere are the system which somebody has designed, or where somebody has created the data sets, data training sets very poorly, so that only faces of white males can be recognized and even release this. I mean, come on. I mean, this is basic HCI 101. So I think I would want the argument is to understand that all of this is made. I mean, somebody designed the code and made decisions. You may, I mean, most experts don't even experts don't understand how generative AI works, what's going on in the different layers, which is a fairly scary thought, to be honest. So the question then becomes, how do we prepare people for a world in which computation infrastructures are everywhere? And where they have a voice, I mean, an ability to participate, even if they're not citizens. So to come back to your activities, I think all of those computation activities are important, but I try to think now when I design activities where I can hit all the 3 points, where I can help students to learn particular skills, you know, be it looping structures, conditionals, I mean, anything. But I also want them to be expressive, so there can be personalized artifact. Not everybody has to design the same application. And I know that in the electronic textile curriculum, every class had 30 different 3-dimensional artifacts. I mean, but I also, at the same time, want students to have critical discussions about who and what computing is. So when we do the electronic textiles, it's also about the high and low tech. Why do even high school students think that only the girls should sew and all the boys should code? And you believe me, I mean, that is still happening these days. So I think this opens up for you as a teacher a possibility of conversation on where these values come from, on why do we think that? I mean, and what is good and bad about that? Why do we kind of, you know, gender technologies? I mean, Silicon Valley does it, has forgotten about the whole history, which is a whole nother problem with all the CS we're teaching. We're being so ahistorical, we don't even know where all of this is coming from. So I think as educators, it behooves us to think about, it's like the books we choose to kind of raise certain topics, I mean, introduce certain conversations. I think in computer science, we're only reading one book, but we, you know, similarly in language arts, we have multiple ways to kind of, multiple topics we can choose, that we can have those conversations, allow for that expressiveness, which students find so attractive, but also teach the critical concepts and skills. it doesn't have to be separate. I mean, it doesn't have to be our ethics discussion. Now let's talk what's all bad about technology or what's critical. It can be integrated. And I think good instruction always has kind of done that. And not every project has to hit all the points.
Integration is where I've struggled. I'm trying to get collaboration in my school. Before the pandemic, we had a group working together to try to integrate computer science across the different disciplines. And then the pandemic hit and our effort fell apart. But so on my own, I've been trying to build bridges between the disciplines. And last year I got a wearable technology project with two of my colleagues working together, funded by MassQ. And we were able to get the fashion students to work with my programming students in order to create wearable fashion technology, except to fit it within the structure that we had in our school. It was fashion students working with programming students, and it was my male programming students who volunteered to do that, and the fashion students were all girls. And they weren't working together on the technology. They were siloed. So it was very disheartening, but it was a first stab. We have to find ways to have everybody working on every part of that project. And that's one of the challenges, is that I'm still working within the existing structure. So.
Yeah, Mark Gastal at University of Michigan is now kind of doing a lot of integration of computing in social studies, histories. I mean, to look not just as a separate class, but where kind of the contact points in those disciplines are for teachers to kind of integrate and also to develop particular tools. Not everybody has to kind of use the same programming languages and all of that. So I think we still definitely have a lot of work to do, that the CS classes are just the tip of the iceberg.
So talking about the structures of schools brings us to the next one, which is Megan's comment. Do you want to ask it as a question, Megan, or do you want me to read your comment?
No, I just was trying to clarify the kind of point on schooling I was trying to nudge on. And I think Yasmin thinks about this too, which is essentially, could computer science be a tool or a lever to kind of begin to create more of the kind of changes we've wanted in schooling for a long time, the structural kinds of changes that are required to create learning opportunities for young people, right? So, part of what computer science is asking us to do is not only think critically and take on critical real world problems, but it's also asking us to do that across ages, across domains, right, in ways that schools aren't designed for. And so the question is, could we use computer science and our work in computer science to kind of really figure out a way to move schools closer to the kinds of structured learning that we know is good for young people?
Well, that was certainly also Seymour's ideas in Mindstorms, because, I mean, even though everybody took the book about the turtle and the computer, he said I have always a book about different pedagogies of schooling and what kind of learning could be. But most people kind of, were seeing the computer as a primary force. I mean, the possibilities, are there, because what computation allows us is to skip the boundaries of time. I mean, we now have abilities that students can take the work they're doing in school home. I mean, we experimented even at UCLA. Remember, early people took floppy disks home.
Yes, I do.
I mean, before internet was kind of accessible to everybody. And that, there are really interesting projects where people students submit their homework, the teacher kind of knows where the problem is and can kind of tailor instruction. Jeremy Richal at Digital Promise has kind of worked on that project, which I think are really interesting models, which work on all fronts. I mean, the teachers kind of get the homework grading done easily, but they get the critical information they need for their classes before students even show up. And so I think there are models also connecting to parents or to others, which are definitely possible, but they're also very difficult to realize in the current kind of school structure. One thing which COVID has kind of made possible that people all got online because they had to. However badly that happened during the last 3 years, because teachers most definitely were not given the resources and the time to adapt their curriculum, to be taught online. But the 3 years, I think, were long enough to kind of help people understand that there are possibilities where we can extend beyond the school day and create connections. We had interesting projects where suddenly family members participated in computer science classes, something which would never happen otherwise. I think that is really not accessible to parents and could help students with crafting and other aspects. So I think there are great opportunities, like there are with many other technologies and interventions. And I would say that probably, in some schools and classroom, teachers are very adept at realizing that. What I see, what teachers are doing beyond teaching content and making connections to other classes, to other schools, reaching out, bringing in students. But it is a possibility, but difficult to realize. And given what's happening right now, the teachers are leaving in masses the profession, probably harder than easier to realize.
I don't see any other hands. Does anyone else want to ask a question before we, oh, there's Ali.
Thank you very much. Your work on the 3 framings of computational thinking was really motivational catalyst for me while I was designing my research, and it really motivated me to use something different than cognitive side. When I was going through your presentation, I have a question. Do you see the data-driven computational thinking 3.0 will in future make CT 1.0 obsolete? Or do you think that these 2 things can work together hand to hand, like a fragment of like one whole system?
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for bringing up that question. I think this wasn't clearly articulated. I don't think computational thinking, rule-driven systems are going away. They're going to coexist with right now, the discussion makes it seem like everything will be generative AI. But when we were talking about computational thinking, we most of the time talk just about kind of code-driven, rule-driven systems. And now we realize there are a whole genre of other systems which are designed and how they're designed. And so we have to develop new models of testing and auditing and new models of designing them. So I think they're going to coexist. Right now, the hype suggests otherwise. And we also have to realize that all the foundational work over the last 10 years, which people like Jane Margolis and others have done in kind of helping to launch CS education, has created a cadre. I think there's about nearly 4,000 ECS teachers who are very familiar with one model. So we need to work on kind of bringing in the other model. But I think there are even similar activities which already exist, which can be modified to incorporate more generative AI. Again, I think that is where we as instructional, educational designers and researchers have a responsibility to figure out what are kind of great activities for which age level. Now that we also have, the ability to work with systems which don't necessarily require code writing. How can we leverage this to bring younger students in? What is the kind of progression? Many of the same questions we have been asking about CT 1.0 and are kind of working on tackling, we just kind of have added more. And if you read the book by Peter Denning and Matti Taidio on computational thinking, it's part of the MIT Press Essential Knowledge series. it has a really great section at the end, the last 6-7 pages, on all the things which will change. I mean, in computing, I mean, and I think that's something we just have to be, I mean, to deal with, that we can't stand still on the knowledge from 10, 20 years ago. We need to incorporate that, whatever comes up, into the curriculum. It's the same in the sciences. I mean, the knowledge, you know, has changed on how we understand genetics, epidemics, and all of that. And accordingly, the K-12 curriculum and teacher training has to change. I mean, not that we have such a great job in kind of preparing the K-12 CS teacher education pipeline. And we have a lot of challenges ahead of getting this into schools of education. But the other countries like the UK and other places which have started earlier and have made that a national premise and created infrastructures for that, not just in terms of for teachers, for sharing resources and materials. So it's possible to do that on a larger scale.
Thank you very much.
James, did you have another question? Okay. Walter, did you want to follow up on your comment, or was that just a comment in the comment box, chat box?
It was my attempt not to be doubly intrusive. But yeah, I think so. A kind of inclusive design would be thinking about the group as the unit. And if you want to bridge the gap between two schools, one of the things I tried very hard to remind people of, even at the Media Lab and then through my career, is that schools are structured around groups. Classrooms are group contexts, and that we do an awful job of designing the most conspicuous feature of a group, of a classroom, of schools, that would also leverage ideas of inclusivity, distinct voice. They're all there, right? Until we crush them and, you know, they leave school. But assuming we don't do that, if we actually designed for the group space, I think computational thinking would be embedded in a socially rich context along the lines of what the literacy was for Freire. I mean, that word expressivity that I borrow when you talk about generative design is his sense of expressivity being a kind of social and disruptive and transformative act. So if I was going to follow up on Megan's or what thought, is a way to get to what you're talking about with CT 3.0 is to think from the beginning about group design, situated in group. What would it mean to interact in that kind of context and design for that? And that may have something to do with our group-based cloud computing project, but that's that's not meant to be a pitch. I think of your work and then Megan's question is incredibly thoughtful. And so what would it mean for us to make those at the front edge of the design, instead of you have to get out from the middle of the circle as if you're ever going to get that far, right? What if we just start there, right? I mean, one of the problems is, we got to cover the curriculum and then we might get to the socially situated. And then if we're really lucky, we might bring up questions of voice or, you know, privilege and power, right? That the danger of a diagram that looks like that is that people get stuck in the middle, right? And it's not your intent at all, but just knowing how sometimes people's thinking becomes kind of, let's go for the bullseye and then work our way out if we have time. To flip it on its head is to just sort of say, let's just start with a group and then maybe work our way inward to the extent that might be useful.
Yeah, I'm going to change that donut. Okay, I mean, you know, it was a first attempt to put it all together, but I'm also thankful. I'm just scanning the comments on the notion of inclusivity, in particular, since computational technology is thinking about David Rose's CAST Center at Harvard have been so prominent and helpful in kind of addressing adaptability to different kind of learning needs. So, and that has still also been very absent in CS education. I see one hand, Paul.
I don't know if this is a change of subject here, but thank you so much for coming and to the Computational group. And I'm thrilled to see some folks I haven't even seen in a while, Walter included. But actually, earlier today, I was puzzling over the possibility, in this was a very specific case of using Minecraft to teach a specific subject. But the subject came up that as soon as the pedagogy looks like learning, there's a tendency to turn it off. So the concept is, do we try to mask the idea that we're forcing learning into the scenario? And one way that might be doable, one way that might be done, is to make it a group activity. If it's a group activity, how do I interact with somebody else? I'm not actually forcing a learning pedagogy on somebody. You know, I mean, anyway, it's just something that came up today. You know, which way do you lean? Do you try to make it look educational? And if you try to make it look educational, you cause a turnoff, if you will, to the younger groups.
I mean, if you're in a school setting, it's going to be educational, but I also, to follow up on Walter's comment on groups, I mean, you can design tasks where there is mutual dependency. I mean, we did this actually once in a programming activity where groups of students took over different parts, but were all contributing to the same larger kind of final artifact. But there was a really interesting interdependency also programming wise. I mean, that variables, data structures, and today's programming environments actually makes that much more feasible. It used to be much more harder to share. So I think you can design tasks where it's not just the individual students working on a project, but where there is a group activity and everybody contributes a smaller piece to the larger good. I mean, in the electronic textiles, we always have a quilt which we built, and everybody contributes a piece as an introduction to programming. And then students move on back to an individual project, but I can see either direction. So I think, you know, in education, I mean, Marlinska and Amalia and Carburetor taught it intentional design. You're designing learning opportunities. So it's not just haphazard. And I think you can think about the group work. And actually, the Cecil environment was always a great example to move beyond the classroom into the school and have, I mean, groups of students across the classroom boundaries collaborate and contribute to the knowledge building. I mean, so the models for that and examples on how that works are already there. So I think, you know, if students think learning is all bad, I remember the one example from the one gentleman here from James, you know, and then they suddenly see it's fun. I mean, and once they kind of get into the activity. So I don't think that precludes necessarily that this can be a rich and meaningful activity.
Okay. Just an example from today.
Yeah. Yep. But I also think, you know, it's not like chocolate covered broccoli, you know. I think that's an expression which Sasha Barat once used. You know, it's like I think you as a teacher think about what is a meaningful activity for students to engage in, and alone or together in a group, what are the goals? So we often, in like the electronic textile project, actually all the teachers make their own artifacts and bring them into the classroom to show to students that they also have made these artifacts, what they learned, what worked, what doesn't work, to be kind of part of a larger community. So it's not just the kids' activity or the students' activities, the teachers are part of the classroom community as well.
Good point. Like, love that one.
So.
Hello, Wally.
Oh,
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
hello, Dr. Yeah, good evening. So sorry, it's night here, almost midnight in Nigeria. So just trying to follow up what is going on. But my number one question, I'm trying to make some comment, but number one, I'm trying to look at the affordability and accessibility of some of these tools that is not still much available to the third world country. That's just we still have a bit of limited instructors, learning infrastructure to actually, help students able to think critically and also develop their computational thinking skill. And most times in Africa, we believe that for students to think, to have computational thinking, they must learn coding and programming as limited today. And very few students have access to learn about coding and programming. So my number one question, is there another way student can learn how to gain the skill of computational thinking? And also, my second question is for us to be able to localize the content for students to learn at their own local community, because the key, like I said, the key in my comment, the key point I'm looking at is that is for students to be able to think out of the box, think critically, and able to solve immediate societal problems or challenges. That's one of the major reasons why we teach them how to think out of the box, computational thinking, and the processes. So should we able to localize the content to fit in the community, and then while looking at the bigger picture at the maybe at the global scale, but first the local content, so that students at the locality can understand their immediate challenges and immediate problems.
Thank you for your question. Let me actually start with the second one about localizing content. I think that is a really great idea. And localizing content can mean different things. It can mean when you work, like I showed you this gentrification app, which was located somewhere in California, San Francisco, Oakland, and looking at that, I mean, you can definitely do these kind of things, but I also think about localizing content in terms of where are students' experiences with technology? What are they using every day as a way to make connection points into computer science? Because they all have already experiences. And I mean, good teaching is about kind of building on this informal knowledge. I mean, these informal understanding students have and leveraging this to kind of get them to question and to look behind the curtain. In response to your first question in terms of, I mean, I have been a big proponent for students learning coding as a way to make technology more transparent, to better understand what kind of sits behind the pixel on the screen. Now there are CS Unplugged activity which Tim Bell has developed, which introduce a lot of the same context. But I think this kind of application-driven design or working in contexts like Minecraft, kind of making, designing aspects of the environment is something which is kind of very motivating and powerful for students. I mean, because they are already in a context, they have a community, they have examples, they can look there's a whole YouTube communities. I mean, if you go beyond Minecraft, Roblox, and everything else you have. And those are all important kind of components of youth culture today, on where programming and participation already happens outside of school, at least for, actually for a very large number of people. If you look at the multi-million views those kind of video communities and peer teaching already have. So rather than to ignore, I would kind of think about how can we kind of integrate this and make this part of the learning enterprise rather than to keep it completely separate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Thank you. Yeah, that's clear.
Okay.
Excellent. Any more questions?
Oh,
Collins?
Yes, if you have some time, I'd like to ask a question relating to what you mentioned about artificial intelligence and artificial augmentation. Now, I think the hype with technology right now where we're at is the ability to be able to process large amounts of data that is not humanly possible. And people are looking at that as a miracle of sorts. But I think this ties with what you said. What they're missing out is the ability to leverage what we have in terms of technology and to use that. You talked about groups of students working together in order to produce something. So I'm thinking about, say, students in an elementary or middle school class, and how can they leverage like these resources that we have now? Because some schools, as you mentioned, are banning the use of technologies. So how can we leverage the use of these technologies to help improve education? Because we've had that education has stayed the same way for years, while other industries have made progress in the past 100 years. They said that schools are still following the same method. So how can we get on the wagon and just like help to improve this sector that we're in?
Yeah, just it's intelligent augmentation, IA, not artificial augmentation. The flip of AI and IA.
Gotcha.
I mean, there are hey, even Google released programming languages where you can essentially build your own machine learning system. So so there are several tools out there. And as somebody early on, the first commenter after my talk talked about, MIT has released a curriculum with examples. So we have already several examples of what students at different ages can do. I think for me, as a computer science educator, one of the most surprising aspects was of machine learning, how in particular younger students, how accessible they are to them because they don't need to write code. Now the question becomes, how do you move beyond just kind of trivial activities? I mean, where we haven't really, I think, thought carefully through what are the kind of different concepts, how do they build on each other, what are different activities and experiences which would work well in a classroom setting, and also what are the tools and what are teachers doing in order to make that work. I mean, we're just figuring this out for kind of rule-driven, code-driven K-12 CS education. So we have a lot of kind of groundwork to do to map out the same things for, if you want, computational thinking 2.0, which works well with machine learning. On the other hand, I think there are enough examples out there that we can kind of start mapping out a learning progression on what that would look like in K-12 CS education. So the tools, I mean, have already, I mean, there's in England, eCraft Learn by Ken Khan. There's a number of tools which are already available.
Would you put citizen science into this category?
I mean, it could be a form of citizen science. I mean, in terms of working with these systems, developing and training them.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
I think we have worn out our guest. This has been fantastic. There's been a few comments in the sidebar that also echo that this has been fantastic. I know you haven't been able to see them, but I want to make sure that you know people have been commenting on that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. We've really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I mean, it's such a hot topic right now. Even my dean is interested in AI. And, you know, usually in schools of education, all the ed tech, the CS stuff is kind of on the margin. I mean, this is now it's on everybody's agenda. So it gave me an opportunity to kind of start thinking about it on how in CS education we think about integrating and addressing these issues, and also what are the kind of next challenges ahead. Well, thanks for spending a Friday afternoon with me. It was a pleasure being here for the invitation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you, Chandra, for the invitation. Bye-bye.